Next on Book TV, Candice Millard recounts the assassination of America's 20th president, James Garfield. Miss Millard speaks at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Mentor, Ohio.
Pleasure to introduce to you tonight our speaker. Candice Millard is an excellent writer, formerly of National Geographic magazine, and now we're very excited to have her here to talk about her second book. Her first book was The River of Doubt, about Theodore Roosevelt's perilous journey down the Amazon after his presidency. And we're very, very pleased here that she's chosen to tackle another interesting presidential subject, that being the assassination of President James A. Garfield. I believe this is her third or fourth trip here to the site between research and other things she's done here for us and with us, and it's really a great pleasure to welcome him here tonight. Please make her feel welcome, Candice Millard.
Thank you for that introduction, Todd, and thank you all for coming. It is a real pleasure to be here, and it is a great honor to be able to speak at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. And I also wanted to say a particular thank you to the Garfield family as well, which has been incredibly kind and generous and helpful to me throughout this whole process. So thank you so much. At heart, this book is not about politics or science or even the shooting of a president. It's about an extraordinary drama that took place inside the White House over more than 2 months. In the 130 years since Garfield's death, his story has been largely forgotten. But even at the time, even though the entire nation, the entire world was watching, no one really understood what was happening. What began as a shooting became an incredible struggle for power and ambition. The result was the brutal death of one of our most promising leaders at the hands of his own physicians. This is an intimate, heartbreaking story of ignorance versus science, greed versus heroism. James Garfield was not, as he has often been remembered to be, just a bland, bearded 19th century politician. On the contrary, that's the wrong picture. I'm not sure what went up, but on the contrary, he was one of the most extraordinary men ever elected president. Although he was born into desperate poverty, he became a professor of literature, mathematics, and ancient languages when he was just a sophomore in college. By the time he was 26 years old, he was a college president. He knew the entire Aeneid by heart in Latin. While he was in Congress, he wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. To me, though, what is more inspirational and more astonishing, even than Garfield's brilliance, was his decency. You know, I wrote a book about Theodore Roosevelt, and I have great admiration for him. He was a firebrand. He was the hero, the center of every drama. That's not Garfield. Garfield was the calmest, wisest man in the room. He was a good, kind, honest man who was just trying his best. He was a real person, not consumed by ego and ambition, someone who was simply trying to do the right thing. Even after 17 years in Congress, in one of the most ruthless, vicious eras of machine politics, Garfield never changed. His friends used to marvel at his patience and forbearance, even in the face of the most brutal personal attacks. But Garfield was incapable of holding a grudge. He used to just shrug and say, "I'm a poor hater." Although Garfield took his presidency very seriously, he had never had what he called presidential fever. In fact, he never really ran for any office. People asked him to run, and he did, but he would never even campaign. He always made it clear that he was going to follow his own conscience and convictions, and if people didn't agree with him, they shouldn't vote for him. When Garfield went to the Republican convention in the summer of 1880, not only was he not a candidate, he didn't even want to be one. He had gone there to give a speech, and he was kicking himself because he wasn't prepared. He wrote a letter home telling his wife that he was just sick about the fact that he hadn't written the speech before the convention, and now he wouldn't have time. The convention was an enormous hall in Chicago. There were 15,000 people there, and the favorite to win by far was Ulysses S. Grant, who was trying for a third term in the White House. In the midst of this chaos and noise of thousands of people, Garfield got up to speak, and his speech was so powerful and so eloquent, and again, largely extemporaneous, that the hall slowly fell silent until the only thing you could hear was Garfield's voice. And everyone was just riveted. They were spellbound. And at one point, Garfield said, "And so, gentlemen, I ask you, what do we want?" And someone shouted, "We want Garfield!" And the entire hall just went crazy. And when the balloting began, delegates began casting their ballots for Garfield, even though, again, he wasn't even a candidate. And he stood up and he objected, but the votes kept coming, and he couldn't stop what was happening. And what was a trickle became a stream, became a river, and then finally a flood of votes. And before Garfield knew it, he was the Republican nominee for President of the United States. What I found again and again and again while I was researching this book was that not only was Garfield's life and nomination and brief presidency full of incredible stories, but the people who surrounded him were also unbelievable. You just couldn't make them up. First, of course, there's Charles Guiteau, Garfield's would-be assassin. Guiteau was a deeply, dangerously delusional man, but he was very intelligent and highly articulate. If you read nearly any other account of Garfield's assassination, Guiteau is described as a disgruntled office seeker. But that doesn't cover the smallest part of it. He was a uniquely American character. He was a product of this country at that time, a time when there was a lot of play in the joints, and there was no one to really understand what he was up to and hold him to account for it. Guiteau was a self-made madman. He was smart and scrappy. He was a clever opportunist, and he would probably have been very successful if he hadn't been insane. Guiteau had tried everything, and he had failed at everything. He had tried law, evangelism, even a free love commune in the 1800s, and he had failed even at that. The women in the commune nicknamed him Charles Get Out. But he survived on sheer audacity. He traveled all over the country by train and never bought a ticket. He took great pride in moving from boarding house to boarding house, slipping out when the rent was due. And even when he occasionally worked as a bill collector, he would just keep whatever he managed to collect. After the Republican convention, Guiteau became obsessed with Garfield, and immediately after the election, he began to stalk the president. He went to the White House nearly every day. At one point, he even walked into the president's office while the president was in it. He even attended a reception and introduced himself to Garfield's wife. He shook her hand, he gave her his card, and he slowly pronounced his name so she wouldn't forget him. It's like a Hitchcock movie. It's incredibly creepy and absolutely terrifying. Finally, Guiteau had what he believed was a divine inspiration. God wanted him to kill the president. It was nothing personal, he would later say, simply God's will. As strange and fascinating and nearly as dangerous as Guiteau was Senator Roscoe Conkling. And that's Chester Arthur. We've skipped a picture. Conkling, we're skipping pictures. Conkling was a vain, preening, brutally powerful machine politician who appointed himself Garfield's enemy. He wore, there's Conkling. He wore canary yellow waistcoats. He used lavender ink. He had, as you can see, this great spit curl in the middle of his forehead, and he recoiled at the slightest touch. In fact, his vanity was so outsized that he was famously ridiculed for it by another congressman on the floor of Congress. But Conkling was no joke. He was dangerously powerful. As a senior senator from New York, he controlled the New York Customs House, which was the largest federal office in the United States and controlled 70% of the country's customs revenue. Conkling tightly controlled patronage within his state, and he expected complete and unquestioning loyalty. In fact, his apartment in New York was known as the morgue. Conkling was enraged when his candidate, former President Grant, didn't get the nomination, but he was apoplectic when he realized that he couldn't control Garfield. To Conkling, the attempt on Garfield's life was his ticket back into power. But for the first time in Conkling's life, nothing turned out as he planned. Chester Arthur was Garfield's vice president, but he was Conkling's man. Politically, he was completely Conkling's creation. In fact, the only other political office he had ever held was as the collector of the New York Customs House, a position that Conkling, through President Grant, had given to him. In that position, he made as much money as the president, and he never showed up for work before noon. Arthur preferred a life of leisure. He liked fine clothes, old wine, late dinner parties, and he was nearly as preening as Conkling. In fact, he even moved his birth date back a year to appear more youthful. Even within the Republican Party, Arthur's nomination was considered a ridiculous burlesque. After the election, Arthur continued to make it clear where his loyalties lay. He went on vacations with Conkling, he even lived with him for a time in DC, and he took every opportunity to publicly criticize the president. And then, suddenly, everything changed. After Garfield was shot, Arthur made a transformation so stunning and complete that no one could believe it. The entire country was horrified by the thought that Chester Arthur might be president. But unlike Conkling, Arthur was sickened and grief-stricken by the shooting. The last thing he wanted was for Garfield to die. He hid himself from public view. He refused even to go to Washington for fear that it would look like he was waiting in the wings. And he cut himself off from Conkling. Finally, after turning his back on the man who had made him, Arthur found moral strength in the most unlikely of places: the letters of a young, invalid woman named Julia Sand. Sand believed in Arthur when no one else did, when he didn't even believe in himself. After the shooting, Sand wrote to Arthur, "If there is a spark of true nobility in you, now is the occasion to let it shine. Faith in your better nature forces me to write to you, but not to ask you to resign. Do what is more difficult and more brave: reform." And to everyone's amazement, not least of all Arthur's, he did. He changed dramatically, and he tried to be the president Garfield would have been had he lived. He became an honest and respected leader, and he never forgot Julia Sand. Not only did he keep her letters, he wrote her back, and he even went to visit her. One day after Sunday dinner, Sand was at her brother's house, and a highly polished carriage pulled up in front of the house. And to Sand's astonishment, President Arthur stepped out. He had come to thank her in person for her help. The reason Arthur became president was not Guiteau's madness. or even Conkling's political maneuverings, but the ambition, ignorance, and dangerous arrogance of the man who assumed control of Garfield's medical care, Dr. Willard Bliss. That's right, his first name was Doctor. His parents had named him Doctor. Bliss was a well-known surgeon with a profitable practice. In fact, he'd even been one of the doctors at Abraham Lincoln's bedside. But he had far from a sterling reputation. He had enthusiastically sold something called Kundurango, which was supposed to cure cancer, syphilis, ulcers, chronic blood diseases, you name it. Bliss had even been disgraced for taking bribes, and he had spent a small amount of time in prison. When Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, who was Garfield's Secretary of War, sent for Bliss after the shooting, Bliss saw in this national tragedy a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for fame and power. He immediately took charge of the president's medical care, even though no one had given him the authority. He just took it. He dismissed the other doctors, and he completely isolated Garfield in a sick room in the White House. He wouldn't even let him see his Secretary of State. And what happened in that room, inside the White House, is nothing short of horrifying. Bliss and the few surgeons he had handpicked to help him inserted unsterilized fingers and instruments in Garfield's back again and again, day after day, searching for Guiteau's bullet. The last thing Bliss wanted was for Garfield to die. He had too much at stake, but his own arrogance and ignorance were slowly and excruciatingly killing the president. The only hope for Garfield was to find the bullet and end the search, but this was 14 years before the invention of the medical X-ray. What happened next is nothing short of incredible. Only the most brazen novelist would make it up. None other than Alexander Graham Bell stepped forward to help. Bell, a young, restless genius, had invented the telephone just 5 years earlier when he was only 29 years old. By 1881, the telephone had earned him some money and a lot of fame, but he wanted nothing to do with the company that had grown up around it. He said it was hateful to him at all times and that it fettered him as an inventor. Worse even than the business were the lawsuits against the telephone. There were 600 lawsuits against it, 5 of which went to the United States Supreme Court. Finally, Bell had had enough. He said he was sick of the telephone, and he quit the Bell Telephone Company. Bell just wanted to help people. He had lost both of his brothers to tuberculosis before he was 24 years old. Both his wife and his mother were deaf, and he knew that he could make life better for people, maybe even save lives. But he worked so hard that his parents and his wife were terrified that he would literally work himself to death. When he was working, he wouldn't stop to eat or rest. His only respite was to play the piano deep into the night. But even then, he played with such an intensity that his mother, who had taught him to play, called it a musical fever. When Garfield was shot, Bell turned his life upside down to help him. It sickened him to think of Garfield's doctors blindly searching for the bullet. Science, he thought, should be able to do better than that. Bell abandoned everything he was doing and spent day and night inventing something called an induction balance, which was basically a metal detector that he hooked up to a telephone receiver, and which he slowly ran over the president's body, listening for a telltale buzzing that would tell him where the bullet was lodged. In the end, Bell and science were defeated, but not because the invention didn't work. It did work. In fact, it went on to save countless lives before the invention of the medical X-ray. Alexander Graham Bell was defeated by the arrogance, the ambition, and the ignorance of the president's own doctors. As I began my research for this book, the question that kept coming to me was, how could this have happened? What I found was, first of all, the presidency in 1881 was very different from the presidency today. First of all, Secret Service. This is 16 years after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and there's still no Secret Service protection for the presidency. Garfield had only his 24-year-old private secretary and an aging policeman. Not only was the president not protected from the public, but he was expected to interact with them one-on-one, face-to-face, on a daily basis. You have to remember that this is the height of the spoils system, and many Americans believed that they were entitled to government jobs, even if they had no training or credentials for them. More than that, they insisted on making their case directly to the president himself. Garfield was forced to meet with office seekers from 10:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. every day. And the situation made him desperate. He longed for time to work and think, and he wondered why anyone would ever want to be president. But while he found office seekers tiresome, even maddening, he never considered them to be dangerous. He said that assassination can no more be guarded against than death by lightning, and it's best not to worry about either. He walked all around the city by himself all the time. In fact, one night he left the White House. He walked down the street to his Secretary of State's house. They walked alone together through the streets of Washington, with Guiteau following them the entire way, holding a loaded gun. In fact, by that time, Guiteau had been stalking the president for weeks. He had even followed him to church and had considered shooting him in church. Finally, he made his decision. The president, he knew, would be at the Baltimore and Potomac train station in Washington, D.C. on the morning of July 2nd, 1881, and Guiteau would be waiting. The moment Garfield walked into the station that morning, Guiteau stepped out of the shadows and shot him twice. The first bullet hit the president in the arm. A second ripped through his back. By an incredible stroke of luck, however, Guiteau didn't kill Garfield. He only wounded him. The bullet that tore through his back didn't hit his spinal cord. It didn't hit any vital organs. Today, he would have spent a few nights in the hospital. Even if he had just been left alone, he almost certainly would have survived. Unfortunately for Garfield and the nation, Dr. Bliss stepped in. Bliss took advantage of the fear and the chaos that followed the shooting to assume control of Garfield's medical care. But he was not only ambitious and arrogant, he adhered to the most traditional medical methods of the time. Bliss gave Garfield, a gunshot victim, rich foods and alcohol. He took great satisfaction in what he called the healthy pus issuing from the president's infected wound. And he avoided any treatment he considered to be new and radical, including antisepsis. The renowned British surgeon Joseph Lister had discovered antisepsis, the prevention of infection by destroying germs, 16 years earlier. The death rate in his surgical ward had plummeted, and he had traveled all around begging doctors to sterilize their hands and their instruments, and warning them that if they didn't, they ran the very real risk of killing their patients. By 1881, antisepsis was widely accepted in Europe, but the most experienced and respected doctors in the United States still dismissed it as useless, even dangerous. Some still didn't even really believe in germs. They laughingly referred to them as invisible germs, and they certainly didn't want to go to all the trouble that antisepsis required to kill them. They took great pride in what they called the good old surgical stink. They would not change or wash their surgical aprons because they believed that the more blood and pus that was encrusted on them, the more experience it showed. Even those who tried antisepsis had little success for reasons that today seem painfully clear. They would sterilize their knives, but if they dropped them during surgery, they would just pick them up and continue using them. If they needed both of their hands during surgery, they would hold the knife in their teeth and then use it. Even Alexander Graham Bell could not outrace the infection that was coursing through Garfield's body. The story, however, doesn't end there. Garfield's death brought about tremendous changes, changes in medicine, in politics, in the fabric of our nation. As soon as Garfield's autopsy was released, the American people understood that their president didn't have to die, and they understood why he did. Bliss was publicly disgraced, and antisepsis was adopted across the country. Americans turned their rage and their grief on the political system that had encouraged a madman like Guiteau. Chester Arthur himself, who owed his entire career to patronage, signed the Pendleton Act, which was the beginning of the end of the spoils system. Garfield's death also brought the country together in a way that had not been seen since the Civil War. Lincoln's assassination had only deepened that divide, but Garfield had been the first president who was accepted by the South since the Civil War. He was accepted as the leader of the whole country, North and South, immigrant and pioneer, freedman and former slave owner. His death was their loss, and their common grief brought them together. Above all, Garfield's death changed the presidency itself. You could argue that this really marked the end of the idealistic or perhaps naive concept of the president alone meeting with office seekers, personally making appointments at every level of government. It was obviously an unworkable system for many reasons. It was open to corruption, it was completely inefficient, and it was personally dangerous. It would never have worked as the United States grew into a major world power, and it's good that it's gone. But at the same time, these changes also make it almost impossible to ever again elect someone like Garfield. The presidency today is not about a single person, but about a large, complex institution. The president may be our greatest political celebrity, but his personal power is bounded by and filtered through many layers. He's surrounded by elaborate security, his contact with the public is carefully controlled, and he operates in this bubble of Secret Service officers, high officials, and the press. It is very unlikely that what happened to Garfield could happen today. But by the same token, even if we could find someone like Garfield, we couldn't elect him. The presidency is too big and too distant for Americans to be able to choose someone who isn't even trying to be elected. It seems to be open only to people who are willing to sacrifice almost anything to become president. We have hopefully outgrown the day when a madman could just walk into the Oval Office and an incompetent doctor could seize control of the White House for nearly 3 months, murdering the president in the process. But we likely have also outgrown the day when Americans could recognize the promise of a fine, honest man, a man with no financial support, no political machine, nothing but the strength of his own words and ideas, and in a shining moment of democracy, make him our leader. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
And if you would, if you're going to ask a question, please just approach the microphone here and speak into the microphone, please. Thank you.
Marvelous presentation.
Thank you very much.
Were there any among Garfield's family, friends, or subordinates who championed Bell's machine or Lister's methods? And if so, I mean, how did that play out?
Well, Bell himself offered his help. You know, he, as I said, had quit the Bell Telephone Company, and he had opened a small laboratory in D.C. and as soon as the president was shot, he knew that he could help him, and he offered his help to Bliss. And by that time, although Bliss's public face was that everything's going great, the president is doing very well, he had become desperate, and so he accepted Bell's help. And interestingly, although, as I said, really the most respected and most experienced doctors in the United States dismissed Lister's methods, there were some young doctors who had been studying his methods in Europe and who watched this with growing horror but didn't feel that they could stand up to these well-known doctors. There was, I proudly say, I am, by the way, born and raised Ohioan, but I live in Kansas now, and there was a doctor from Kansas who wrote to Lucretia, Garfield's wife, and told her, don't let them probe the wound, make sure they sterilize everything. But that just never got through to Bliss, who ran things exactly as he wished.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I don't mean to get you off the track, but I'm thinking that Garfield played a very significant role in the 1876 election in the commission that actually elected the president. And if I'm right about that, could you tell me a little bit about that?
So that was a very controversial election in which Hayes was given the presidency. I'm not sure, to be honest, exactly how much of a role Garfield played in that. But it was interesting in that everyone was very, very closely watching the election of 1880 because of this, and also because it was such a stunning nomination for Garfield at the Republican convention. So this election was closely watched, really by everyone except for Garfield, who was very happily here with his family, doing experiments with soil, and was thrilled that he wasn't asked to campaign, which was considered unseemly at that time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I find it very fascinating that three of our great presidents, Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley, were all kindly towards the African Americans and all assassinated. Our calendar this year is the same as 1881, and it was on this date, on a Thursday, and tomorrow, that Garfield's body lay in state in the nation's capital. And I would just thank you for coming here on this day to our hometown. Thank you.
It's my honor. Thank you. Great privilege.
Hi. What do you think about the fact that Garfield quit being a general while the Civil War was still raging to go back into politics? What's your response about Garfield, the politician?
Well, Garfield didn't want to. Abraham Lincoln asked him to come back. He needed him back in Congress fighting the fights that Lincoln had, and Garfield understood that, and it was difficult for him. He loved his regiment, which was many of whom were made up from boys from the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, now Hiram. So it was a difficult decision for him, and he felt very passionately about the Civil War, not only in keeping the country together, but in bringing about abolition. He was a fierce abolitionist, and was a national hero because of his work in the Civil War. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Toward the end of your presentation, you said in the very last paragraph that Dr. Bliss was murdering the president.
Mm-hmm.
You don't impute any malice to him at all, but
I
rather
don't.
utter incompetence.
Yes.
Utter incompetence. And one
Let
more
me make
question,
that clear.
just a little bit about your background. I'm curious to know how you got interested in a subject like this.
Okay. Well, and I'll address the Bliss thing. You're absolutely right. The last thing Bliss wanted was for Garfield to die. In fact, he wrote a letter to a friend on White House stationery saying, I can't afford to have him die, underlining each word. He was desperate. He worked night and day. He lost his health. He lost his practice. But he was incredibly arrogant. He dismissed all the other doctors, and he was willfully ignorant. He knew about antisepsis, and so you have to judge him on that as well. And your other question was how I got interested in the subject. To be honest, I didn't. Even though I grew up in Ohio, I didn't know much about Garfield beyond the fact that he had been assassinated. And I wasn't necessarily interested in writing about another president, but I was interested in science. And I was researching Alexander Graham Bell, and I stumbled upon this story of Bell trying to help save Garfield after Garfield was shot. And I was stunned because, first of all, I'd never heard the story. And secondly, I couldn't understand why Bell, who really was at the height of his fame and his power, would turn his life upside down to do this. I mean, he had a family in Boston, his wife and his children. His wife was pregnant, and they had been planning on going to Maine because it was incredibly hot. And he had just left them and spent all of his time, night and day, working on this. And so it made me wonder, why would he do that? And what was Garfield like? And when I started to research Garfield, I was just completely captivated, and I knew I had to tell this story.
Hi, Candice.
Hi.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I want to kind of go follow his same theme. I know that you are from a small town in Ohio and are a product of public education. How did you become inspired to be a writer?
That's a great question. You know, I didn't ever think I would be a writer. You know, I was a reader. I was a voracious reader. I loved to read, and I thought I would probably teach. And I got an undergraduate master's degree in literature and thought I was going to go and get my PhD, but to be honest, I hated literary criticism, if any of you. And I realized that I really wanted to write. And so really it was a process. You know, it wasn't at all overnight. It was little by little. I got my master's at Baylor, and I moved home, moved in with my parents, literally opened the Yellow Pages, calling every publisher in town looking for a job, and just had all of these little magazine jobs. You know, I worked for a magazine for veterinarians. I had never even had a pet. I knew nothing, sort of figuring it out, and finally got my dream job when I was 28 years old, working at National Geographic. And I was a researcher the first year, but they had this terrific blind test for a writing position on the magazine, and I applied along with 300 other people, and I got the job. And it was like the best thing that had ever happened to me up to that point, and did that for 6 years until I got the idea for my first book. So it's been a journey, but it's been fun, wonderful. Hi.
When the doctor was working on Garfield, why didn't Mrs. Garfield tell the doctor to stop working on Garfield?
That's a wonderful question. You know, this was a time of chaos and confusion and fear. And Bliss came forward very confidently, and in fact, he wrote a letter to the other doctors saying, "The president and I thank you for your help and concern, but your efforts won't be necessary any longer," even though Garfield had never, and Lucretia had never given him that authority. And so Lucretia, you know, even though most doctors knew about antisepsis, Lucretia didn't. And she didn't really understand what was happening, but she did keep on her doctor. She had a female doctor, which was very rare at that time, Dr. Edson, whom they called Mrs. Dr. Edson because they were so uncomfortable with a woman doctor. But Dr. Edson refused to go away when Bliss dismissed all the other doctors, to Bliss's great annoyance. And he said, "All right, you can stay, but you can only, not as a doctor, only as a nurse." But she stayed, and she did what she could. Yes.
What town are you from, and can I find the book in the library by now?
Those are great questions. Thank you. I was born in Marion, Ohio, and I grew up in Lexington, Ohio, which is very close to Mansfield. And I think that Destiny of the Republic probably is in the libraries by now. Yeah. So thank you for asking. I hope you read it.
What's it like to be an author, and if you're going to write a next book, what's it going to be about?
It's really, really fun to be an author. I would recommend it highly. The best part for me is doing the research, because you get to do all these incredible things. When I wrote my first book, The River of Doubt, it's about this unmapped river in the Amazon that Theodore Roosevelt went down. And I got to go to that river. It's still incredibly remote. I hired a pilot in a small plane, and I flew for hours over absolutely unbroken jungle from horizon to horizon. And I met this isolated group of tribesmen who their grandparents and great-grandparents had followed and attacked Roosevelt's expedition, and they remembered it, and they remembered all these stories. So you get these incredible experiences. Researching this book was You know, it was interesting, the difference between, researching the River of Doubt was difficult logistically, planning all those trips. This was difficult emotionally because I became very attached to Garfield. I really cared about him. And it was difficult to see what was happening. I kept wanting to just yell over the span of 130 years, stop, you know, somebody stop these men. But reading his wife's diary, reading his children's diaries, you know, seeing there's actually a section of Garfield's spine in the National Museum of Health and Medicine that was used during the trial. There are also the remains of Charles Guiteau in a drawer with the remains of John Wilkes Booth. It's, yeah. There's actually there's a jar of pieces of Guiteau's brain, which was sent around the country after he was executed to study to see if you could see any physical evidence of insanity. So anyway, it's a very interesting job and just a real privilege to be able to do this. Yes, I am working on a next book. I can't get into details about it because it's really early, but it's going to be about Winston Churchill. Thank you for your question.
I remember hearing about the story of Alexander Graham Bell and what he was doing, and I heard that his thing that he did for the president actually did work, but it went off all the time. It seemed like the bullet was all over the place, but what they didn't realize, it worked because it was picking up the metal bed springs underneath the president, and that's why, you know, they had a hard time finding the bullet. Is that any truth to that story?
That's one of the reasons. Isn't that astonishing? Yeah, and he had actually asked them if the president was, because it was a very new, very rare thing at that time to have a mattress with metal springs in it. And they said no. And in fact, he was on a bed with metal. So obviously that's going to affect a metal detector. The other reason it didn't find the bullet is that Bliss had believed and had publicly stated that the bullet was on the president's right side. And he would only let Bell run the induction balance over the president's right side, and the bullet was on the left.
Wow. And the other one is, I was kind of curious about the old cliche, you know, ignorance is bliss. Mm-hmm. Is this where it comes from?
It's great. I have that in the book, actually. That's very perceptive of you. One, in fact, so after the autopsy results and Bliss is disgraced in newspapers and medical journals, everybody understands, and one of the doctors says, this proves that ignorance is bliss, but it comes from a poem from, I think, the 1700s.
Okay.
Yeah. It's very apropos, unfortunately. Hi.
Did you write any fiction books?
I know I haven't written fiction. You know, fiction and nonfiction writing is very different, and I read a lot of fiction, and I love it. And I've gone to a lot of talks by fiction writers, and I always marvel at myself because they will say, someone will say, "Well, how? You know, what's your process like? What do you do?" And they say, "Well, you know, I sort of let the story lead me, and I kind of follow, and my characters tell me." And to me, that's a nightmare. You know, I know exactly. My process is I spend 3 years writing a book, and the first year is doing foundational research. The entire second year I spend going through that research and outlining and always outline. It's really important. It will help, and it saves you a lot of pain, believe me. And I just work on structure for an entire year, and only then do I start writing. And throughout, though, I'll find holes in my research, and I'll go back and do more, which I love.
That's what my teacher said.
Is that, yeah, listen to her. She's right, she's right. You can't skip the outline. Sorry.
I'd just like to know, what's the term political machine mean?
Well, so this is at the time of machine politics, so it's incredibly corrupt and power-mongering, and so Roscoe Conkling was the sort of pinnacle example of that kind of corruption. I'm sure you've heard of Boss Tweed and stuff. So that really, in the Gilded Age, that's where all that from Mark Twain that comes from. It was just a time of rampant corruption and this
bullying.
Bullying and the spoils system. And you know, things obviously are not perfect now, but if you compare them to that time, we're a lot better off.
when you're doing your research, when you're coming to, able to use like the diaries and like the letters and stuff like that, I mean, how do you go about obtaining that? Is that through, I mean, is that, out there for the public, or you have to get permission from the family or wherever the documents are?
A lot of Garfield's papers, most of his papers in the presidential papers at the Library of Congress, and anybody could see them. You just need a driver's license, you go in and get a reader ID card. But I will say that they are very, very strict with their rules, which they obviously should be. I mean, these are national treasures. But for instance, I'll give you a story here. I'm a good person, and I very carefully follow the rules. But so you're only allowed to have one card at a time, and it can have 5 bins on it at a time. You can only have 1 bin on your desk at a time, and 1 folder out of that bin. So I'm following all the rules, and I open a folder, and there's an envelope in the folder, and it's not sealed, and the face of it is facing the table. And so I open it up, and out spills all of this hair. And I turn it, and it says, "Clipped from President Garfield on his deathbed." I was like, oh my God, and I'm desperately, trying to get it, because I'm like, oh, my career is over. They're going to kick me out. I'll never be able to. So you never know what you're going to find, but it's an adventure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, you mentioned Lucretia Garfield's letters and diary. Are those published?
They are. So
form?
Garfield kept a diary for many, many years, and Lucretia's diary is at the back of the last volume of Garfield's diary published.
Oh.
And then, yes, there's this wonderful volume of letters between Lucretia and James. They only spent 5 months together during the first 5 years of their marriage, because he was either gone fighting during the Civil War, or he was in Washington when he was in Congress, and she was here in Ohio. And so, to her credit, she kept all of those letters. At the end of his life, Garfield questioned if he would have much of a legacy because he had been president for such a brief time, but Lucretia understood who he was, and she understood that he would. And even though, many of those letters are very painful because their early marriage was very difficult, she kept all of them, and they are beautiful. And she, as brilliant as he was, she was his equal intellectually, and I would highly recommend this book on their letters.
Thanks.
I thank you for a very enjoyable evening.
Thank you so much.
I have one question. Wondering, you talked about James Garfield being a multifaceted, multi-talented man. How do you rank him with the others, such as Jefferson?
Yeah, to me personally, and I'm obviously biased, I think had he lived, I believe that he would have been one of our great presidents. I mean, it's impossible to know because he was in office for such a short time. I'm a great admirer of Jefferson, a great admirer of Lincoln, but I think that, honestly, I think Garfield had a mind like Jefferson's and a heart like Lincoln's.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering, is it hard to find the research on him?
It's like being a detective, kind of, and so it's really fun in that way. So you just get to search and search and search. And so when I began, I just cast a very wide net. So I look everywhere in every place. I mean, you look at the obvious places, like I came to Lawnfield several times. I went to the college where he was a student and a teacher and a president, and I went to the Library of Congress. But then I found little, like the New York bar, the Library of the New York Bar has letters from Guiteau, which are just incredible. Or just little universities have bits and pieces here and there, and yeah, it's like a treasure hunt. It's a lot of fun. Any other questions? Okay, that's all right. Yes.
I just have one question to add to the thing about Dr. Bliss. You said he was ruined. Was there any government action taken against him or prosecuted? Did they ever investigate his ineptness?
They didn't, and he, I think the country was heartbroken and enraged and focusing on Charles Guiteau and his trial, because he had an insanity defense, and the country was terrified that he was going to get off and be sent to an asylum instead of being hanged, and that's where the focus was. And also, Bliss never admitted that he had done anything wrong. He, in fact, insisted that he had given the very best medical care to the president. And in fact, he handed Congress a very expensive bill for his work and was outraged when Congress refused to pay it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I have several small questions. First of all, have you ever talked to the group out at Hiram College about this?
I've done research at Hiram College, but I haven't spoken with any group there. Done quite a bit of research in their library.
Do you think this would make a good book for a movie?
Yes.
Well, I think it would make an excellent book for a movie, and I can hardly wait to see it come out. My father was an ordained minister in the same church that Garfield was.
Really?
And I heard somebody say that he rode a horse from here over to the Franklin Christian Church, which is a Disciples of Christ church. Do you know if that's true?
I don't know that story. I'd love to hear it, but I have to say I don't know it. There may be others who do.
That's what I heard anyway.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Are you okay to go back to the table? Is you go to the restroom?
Could I make just one comment?
Hold on. Go ahead, Bob.
As the unelected, but the senior member in this part of the country, as a matter of fact, I'd trade some of those years, but that's not going to work. No, I want to thank you for an absolutely extraordinary undertaking that you took on and achieved so mightily, and you've humanized someone who was a ghost in the past to many people who didn't even know the ghost was there. There have been things written about him and about the family in the past, but nothing begins to compare with what you've done here. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
This event was hosted by the James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Mentor, Ohio. For more information, visit nps.gov/JAGA.